Alright, what's up everybody? Welcome back to the Road to 18-inch arms. So, Q&A again, I did another post on my Instagram story. If you want to participate in these moving forwards, my Instagram is basement.bodybuilding. I'll probably do these maybe once a month or something. They're kind of fun. So, first question, when do you consider a lift plateaued? What do you recommend for plateaued lifts? So, this is going to vary a ton on the individual based on how advanced you are and how fast your progression would be performance-wise. It also depends on the lift that you're using. If you're using a lift that's, say, something like a sumo deadlift, where making weight jumps is going to be fairly easy just because a 5-pound weight increases just such a small percentage of the total of, say, a 500-pound deadlift. But if you're doing something like a dumbbell lateral raise where you're always kind of trying to find that happy medium between like strictness and cheat reps, and you're using anywhere between like 20 and 40-pound dumbbells, a 5-pound weight jump on that is just such a big percentage. So it really does come down to what you're looking to get out of the movement and, again, how advanced you are. So it's kind of a tough question to answer, but I would say try and be a little bit more, I guess, in tune just with how you feel on a certain lift. And that advice kind of goes against the grain. I'm not saying to ditch tracking your training and just using logic and looking at the numbers. I think that's all very important. But I think you can kind of get a sense of, all right, I did, say, 110 pounds on preacher curls for 5, and that was an absolute grinder. My elbow kind of moved around. I shifted around on that 5th rep. But next week, that 5th rep's a little bit easier. And then maybe it's like within reason to try a 6th rep, etc. So you can kind of notice these little things that you won't see on just the very black and white program tracking device that you're using. So I don't know. It's a tough question to answer because it all varies so much based on the circumstance. But essentially, my kind of overarching advice for this is just to be a little bit more in tune with how you feel on a certain lift. You can kind of get a sense of how things are going based on how it's feeling. Next question, what measurements for body parts are, for arms, for example, are considered intermediate? So again, this is going to vary from person to person, but I'd say realistically, if you're about 15 to 20% body fat, I would say anywhere from a 15.5 to a 16-inch arm is going to be intermediate, maybe even a tad lower. But I would say that's roughly probably what you're looking at. And again, height's going to play a role too. So if you're on the shorter side, your standards might be a little bit lower in just overall measurements because obviously proportionate. And I would say also if you're a little bit taller, it might be a little bit higher than that. But again, within, I guess, reason, it's roughly, I'd say 15.5 to 16 inches at 15 to 20% body fat. Next question, what do you think of the volumizing approach of Renaissance periodization, starting at 2 sets and building up to 5 before deload? So I would say there's nothing wrong with this, but it's probably unnecessary. I think a lot of people can get away with just keeping their volume static over time and taking a deload for a specific area if needed. With that said, there could be some potential benefits with this where if you do happen to make better gains at higher volume, but your fatigue is higher, this can kind of let you touch that amount of volume briefly, fairly regularly, without it just running you into the ground. That's really the only benefit I'm seeing here. I don't think volume is an actual method of progressive overload because you're just increasing your workload. There could be some tiny little benefits, but it's not something I would really even consider doing. If I ever did this, it would just be for fun, kind of to experiment. Am I leaving shoulder gains on the table by not doing OHP? This is going to be dependent on the context of your program. I would say if you have just a well-rounded shoulder routine and you ditch overhead press and don't do anything else to make up for it, you're probably leaving gains on the table. But if you're already doing, say, a bunch of chest work and chest is a priority, your front delts are going to be hit pretty hard from that. So I would say in some specific occasions where chest is a high priority, maybe overhead pressing would be almost counterproductive at that point if your volume and your exercise variety is really high for chest. So I would say it might be a little bit of a better idea just to kind of shift that attention to the side and rear delts through isolation lifts. So I think it's dependent on the context of your program. I think in most cases you probably are leaving some gains on the table, but shoulders are one of those weird muscle groups where they're kind of like they're always going to be involved with basically any upper body compound lift at least. So Next question. Your opinion on Natural Hypertrophy's Easy Bar Preacher Curl. It has shorter range of motion and stops at parallel. So, yeah, I remember seeing these a while back. I'm not sure if he's changed his form or changed his stance on this. Personally, my philosophy when it comes to lifting is you want to go through peak resistance, not really just to peak resistance. So, basically on a preacher curl, you'd want to go through parallel. I'm not saying you have to get a full lockout at the bottom and get this crazy stretch that kind of can feel a little bit awkward sometimes. I personally like to go just about all the way to that full lockout, but I would say in a general lifting sense, traveling through peak resistance is usually going to be a good idea. That's why I'm not a huge fan of just straight sets of only partials. That's why I pretty much always do some variation of a full range of motion, but usually skew the resistance profile to bias the length and position. So on a preacher curl, that would mean going below parallel. How long are your workouts? Do you think you can get jacked as a natty within an hour a day? Absolutely. Yeah, I lift for about an hour a day. Occasionally, it's even a little bit less, like on a leg day or something. Uh, but I would say, generally speaking, most workouts are going to be about an hour. Usually, if you're going beyond an hour, it might be touching into some unproductive territory, but then again, it depends so much on your split and how much work you have for that day. So for something like myself, where I'm on a variation of a push-pull leg split, I have a bunch of days of the week that I'm in the gym, so my overall workload per session just isn't that crazy. What's the coolest kind of gym top to wear? I would say the Barbell Apparel Ultralight Tech Tee. This is what I wear in pretty much every session. Ironically, I'm not wearing that one now. I'm wearing the Leonidas Strong t-shirt, which is absolutely sick, supporting our boy Alex Leonidas. So I would say the Ultralight Tech Tee, that's what I wear in basically every video, especially on these arm days. It's the best fitting shirt I've ever worn. You can see them in my collection in the description if you're interested in getting some for yourself. Next question, various progression approaches and how to assess when to swap lifts. So when it comes to swapping lifts, this is something that I think is used a little bit too liberally. I would try and be a little bit more conservative with your lifts, and when you're finding a reason to rotate a lift out of your program, make sure it's a valid reason. And not that there's ever an invalid reason to change a lift out, but sometimes right when you're kind of getting to that sweet spot of a lift within your program, a lot of people find that it gets more difficult, which is true, but that's a good thing, not a bad thing. So your progression will slow down. Maybe it will be a little bit more fatiguing, especially psychologically, when you know you have these heavier weights and kind of bigger numbers to hit. That can be daunting mentally, I would say. So when you get into points like that, where it's not really like this exciting new lift in your program and things are just overall getting more challenging, you usually want to stick through that phase. Stick with that as long as you can, and then once you ever do get to a point where maybe it's beating up your joints, or maybe your progression stalls out a little bit, like actually stalls out, not like, oh, I didn't add a rep this week or for 2 weeks, like a genuine plateau, then it could be worth switching the lift out. But even then, there's ways you can keep lifts in forever. I think one thing a lot of the lifting community doesn't understand is there's ways to keep lifts in your program forever. Lifts aren't guaranteed to just go stale or beat you up. There's some lifts that I've been doing lat pull downs for 8 years. I mean, there's no reason for me to rotate them out because they work well and there's nothing wrong with them. I've been through tons of times where progression is extremely slow. And I think if you look at the overall progression as a whole in that time frame, it's pretty obvious that maybe sometimes I was rushing it a little bit more, sometimes it was plateaued for a little bit longer. But overall things are going well, and there's no reason for me to take that lift out. Do you think it's worth it to incorporate full arm days when your arms are smaller than 16 to 17 inches? So I would say there's some truth to, I guess, using an arm day when you are more advanced compared to when you're a little bit less advanced and maybe you're earlier on in your lifting career. But I would say, generally speaking, having a full arm day, even when you are more advanced, is also pretty tricky because you have to look at not just the arm day itself, but what happens to the rest of the split from there. So take myself, for example, I wouldn't even say I'm advanced. Obviously, I'm getting a little bit bigger. My arms they're closing in on 18 inches. So I don't think I'm advanced yet, but probably like mid to late intermediate for sure. So with this, it's kind of that like trickle down domino effect of what happens when you make an arm day. So when you have an arm day, that means you have to put probably your entire rest of your upper body together, whether it's an upper lower split or more of like an Arnold split. Either way, that's going to be very tricky for someone that is more advanced to handle, because more advanced lifters are stronger. So for myself in particular, I'm a pretty strong guy. I don't really talk about my lifting numbers a whole ton, but for my chest work, my overhead press work, and even a decent amount of my back work, I'm pretty strong. And doing all of that on the same day is incredibly fatiguing. And to some people that could sound like an excuse, and to me that just sounds like programming practically. So if I split my torso up in two between chest and back, and then put the opposite arm with that day, so triceps with pull, biceps with push, that tends to make the program a little bit more evened out. I would say if you're not advanced yet, if your arms are smaller than 16 or 17 inches, it still could be useful to have an arm day if you prefer it. I think there's a pretty, I guess, common message in the lifting industry in general that you don't have to do direct arm work until you're like advanced, which I entirely disagree with. So I would still do your direct arm work, but I'd say as far as having an actual arm day, ultimately that does come down to just preference. I would say the more advanced you get, the more tricky it can be, unless you have everything else at maybe a lower frequency, like maybe a 1.5 times a week split or something like that. Next question, last one for today actually. If you were to build a new home gym, which equipment would you buy first? Love your channel. So there was a very brief instance where I thought I was potentially going to be moving a few weeks ago. So Miss Basement found this house with a massive separate garage, and I was genuinely thinking about what I would buy. So that's kind of funny that you asked this. Don't worry, I'm not leaving the basement yet. So a few more years here, but basically what I would do, I guess I'll keep it fairly realistic. So I'm not just going to say like, oh, I'll get a bunch of Prime machines and spend $500,000 on that. I don't have $500,000 to spend on gym equipment. So what I would do, if I had to buy all new stuff and start from scratch, the first thing I do is buy a nice Smith machine. That's top priority. That's what I use the most. I would also get a very nice preacher curl. Those two are non-negotiables. I would also get a really nice T-bar row machine and a really nice lat pull-down machine. I would get a nice cable station, and then that's pretty much all I would really need. The rest of the machines and stuff that I would want, so something like a pec deck or any selectorized machine is definitely something I would prioritize. I would go all through Cybex, Body Masters, and then if possible, I would try and get some Strive machines. A Strive machine, they're not very popular at all, but basically they're just a regular selectorized machine with an adjustable cam, so you can dictate the resistance profiles, and that's obviously good for making a lift, say, length and mid-range or short bias, and it's also good just for variety's sake, because the home gym obviously has limited space. So with that, that's all I got for today. If you have any questions that you want to see answered, leave them in the comments here, or follow me on the gram, and then submit them next time I do a Q&A poll. So I'll see you guys in the next one.